If you're the kind of person who believes one letter can change a life, then this story will stay with you until the very end. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Legend of West, because the stories you discover here aren't just tales of the frontier. They are journeys of hope, heartbreak, and second chances you'll never forget. Evelyn Carter had crossed half of America chasing a promise written in ink. In her lap rested a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon, each one carefully read so many times the paper had become soft beneath her fingers. For 6 months she had exchanged letters with a rancher named Samuel Reed, a man she had never met but had come to trust more than anyone in the world. His words painted pictures of a quiet ranch in Wyoming, endless grasslands beneath, golden skies, and a small wooden house standing beside a clear creek. He wrote about hard work, honest living, and the kind of peace that only existed far from crowded cities. Most importantly, he wrote that he wanted a wife, not for convenience but for companionship. Evelyn was 23 years old, alone in the world after losing both parents. She had little money, few possessions, and even fewer opportunities waiting for her back east. So when Samuel described a future together beneath western skies, she allowed herself to believe. The train carried her farther west than she had ever traveled before. Every mile seemed to bring her closer to a life she had dreamed about for years. Through the dusty window she watched forests give way to open plains and plains rise toward distant mountains. The land felt enormous, almost intimidating, yet she found comfort in the thought that somewhere beyond those hills, a man was waiting for her. According to his last letter, he would meet her at the station on June 10th. "You won't have trouble recognizing me," he had written. "I'm tall, broad-shouldered, and usually wearing a dark hat." She smiled every time she read those words. As afternoon faded into evening, the conductor finally announced the stop. Pine Creek Station. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the wooden platform. The train hissed behind her before slowly beginning its departure. She looked around immediately. The station was small. A weathered bench sat beneath a crooked sign. A water tower stood nearby. Beyond it stretched a dusty road leading toward town. But there was no tall rancher waiting beside a horse. No Samuel Reed. No welcoming smile. No familiar dark hat. At first she wasn't worried. Ranch work often caused delays. A broken wagon wheel, a loose fence, a sick animal. Any of those could explain his absence. She sat quietly and waited. Minutes became an hour. The sun disappeared behind the Yow Mountains. The air turned colder. Shadows swallowed the platform. One by one, the station lights flickered on. Still, nobody came. Eventually, even the station agent locked the building and headed home. Before leaving, he glanced toward her with concern but asked no questions. Evelyn remained seated alone. The realization came slowly and painfully. Samuel Reed wasn't coming. Every promise inside those letters suddenly felt uncertain. The future she had imagined seemed to dissolve with the daylight, yet she refused to cry. She sat straight-backed beneath the darkening sky, determined not to break. Then she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. A rider emerged from the twilight, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He noticed her immediately. Unlike everyone else, he didn't ride past. He stopped, dismounted, and approached with calm, measured steps. The stranger was rugged and weathered, his face marked by years beneath sun and wind. There was nothing flashy about him, no charm, no polished smile. Yet there was something steady in his eyes that made her feel unexpectedly safe. "Miss," he said quietly, "the last train left a while ago." Evelyn nodded. "I know." His gaze lingered briefly on her trunk and the lonely platform. He seemed to understand more than she had said aloud. "Town's not far," he replied. "There's a boarding house run by a decent woman. You shouldn't spend the night out. Here." She looked toward the dark road and realized she truly had nowhere else to go. The stranger removed his hat politely. "Name's Jacob Walker." Then, after a brief pause, He added words that would change both of their lives forever. "Looks to me like you've been waiting long enough." Jacob Walker lifted Evelyn's trunk onto the pack horse as though it weighed nothing at all. He secured the straps carefully, then started down the dusty road without another question. Evelyn followed beside him beneath a sky crowded with stars. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It felt respectful, as if Jacob understood that some wounds were too fresh for conversation. Pine Creek appeared ahead in scattered pockets of warm yellow light. A general store stood beside a blacksmith shop. Farther down the street, a saloon spilled laughter and piano music into the night. The boarding house sat near the edge of town, a simple, two-story building with white curtains glowing behind its windows. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as Mrs. Harper. She took one look at Evelyn's exhausted face and immediately welcomed her inside. Jacob spoke only a few words. "She needs a room." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Of course she does." When Evelyn reached for her purse, Jacob quietly interrupted. "Put the first week on my account." Before she could object, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness. His kindness lingered long after he was gone. The following days passed slowly. Evelyn helped Mrs. Harper with cooking, cleaning, and bookkeeping to cover part of her expenses. She rarely spoke about the man who had failed to meet her. Most of the town sensed there was a story behind her arrival, but nobody pressed for answers. Pine Creek was the sort of place where people respected silence. A week later, Mrs. Harper knocked on Evelyn's door. "You have a visitor." Evelyn descended the stairs expecting perhaps a letter or a traveler from the east. Instead, she found Jacob standing near the front window, hat in hand. He looked almost uncomfortable being indoors. "Miss Carter," he said, "Mrs. Harper tells me you're good with numbers." Evelyn glanced toward the older woman, who smiled knowingly. "I manage well enough." Jacob nodded. "Then maybe you can help me." He explained that he owned a ranch several miles outside town. For years he had handled every task himself, from cattle to repairs to finances. Unfortunately, bookkeeping was not among his talents. Receipts were piled everywhere. Accounts were unfinished. Bills had vanished beneath stacks of papers. "The whole thing's a disaster," he admitted. "I need someone who can bring order to it." Evelyn listened carefully. The offer wasn't charity, it was honest work. Something inside her stirred for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. Hope. "I'd like that," she said. Jacob seemed relieved. "Good." The next morning she traveled to his ranch. The property rested in a broad valley, surrounded by rolling hills. A creek wound through green grasslands sparkling beneath sunlight. The ranch house itself was sturdy rather than beautiful, built from heavy timber and weathered by countless seasons. Yet there was something comforting about it. It felt dependable, much like its owner. Jacob showed her a small office beside the kitchen. Ledgers covered every surface. Loose receipts overflowed from drawers. Evelyn almost laughed. "You weren't exaggerating." "Never do," Jacob replied. Her work began immediately. Every day she sorted papers, balanced accounts, and rebuilt years of neglected records. The task was enormous but satisfying. Unlike broken promises and vanished dreams, numbers could be fixed. They followed rules. They made sense. Jacob spent most of his days outside working cattle, repairing fences, or tending horses. Often hours passed without seeing him, yet somehow his presence remained everywhere. A cup of fresh coffee appeared on her desk each morning. Firewood was stacked beside the office whenever temperatures dropped. Once she mentioned admiring wildflowers growing near the creek. The next day, a small bouquet rested beside her ledger books. There was never a note. Never an explanation. Just quiet acts of thoughtfulness. As summer faded toward autumn, Evelyn found herself looking forward to evenings. They usually ate supper together at the kitchen table. Conversation remained simple. Ranch work, weather, town news. Yet she discovered she enjoyed listening to him. Jacob spoke little, but when he did, every word mattered. One evening, rain hammered against the roof while wind rattled the windows. The storm knocked out a lantern, plunging the room into darkness. Instinctively, Evelyn reached for the table edge. A moment later, Jacob's hand found hers, strong, warm, steady. Neither of them moved. For several heartbeats, they sat there while thunder rolled across the valley. Then the lantern flickered back to life. Slowly, Jacob withdrew his hand. Neither mentioned what had happened, yet everything felt different afterward. Over the following weeks, she began noticing details she had overlooked before. The gentleness with which he treated injured animals, the patience he showed tired workers, the quiet loneliness hidden behind his calm expression. This ranch, she realized, had been empty long before she arrived. One afternoon, while organizing a storage room, Evelyn discovered a small wooden box containing dozens of hand-carved figures. Birds, horses, deer, every piece crafted with remarkable skill. When Jacob found her examining them, a faint redness touched his face. "Just something to keep my hands busy during winter." She smiled. "They're beautiful." He looked away. "Glad someone thinks so." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever accepted. As autumn leaves painted the valley gold, Evelyn slowly stopped thinking about Samuel Reed. The hurt remained, but it no longer controlled her. The future she once imagined with a stranger had faded into memory. In its place stood something real, something steady, something growing quietly day by day. Neither she nor Jacob spoke about it, yet both could feel it. And neither realized that the past was already riding toward them, carrying a truth that would soon change everything. The first snow of the season arrived early. Thin white flakes drifted across the valley and settled on the ranch roofs like scattered feathers. Evelyn stood by the window of the office watching the snowfall when a rider appeared on the distant road. Visitors were rare during winter. Most travelers waited for better weather. She thought little of it until the rider reached the yard and dismounted. Something about him felt familiar. A strange uneasiness settled in her chest. Jacob was repairing a wagon wheel nearby when the stranger approached. The two men exchanged a few words before Jacob's expression hardened. A moment later, he turned toward the house. "Evelyn," he called quietly. She stepped onto the porch. The moment she saw the stranger's face, her blood turned cold. It was him. Samuel Reed, the man whose letters had carried her across the country, the man who had never appeared at the station. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Snowflakes drifted silently between them. Samuel removed his hat. He looked older than she had imagined. Weaker somehow. "Miss Carter," he said. "I've been looking for you." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. Months of heartbreak, humiliation, and unanswered questions rushed back all at once. "You found me," she replied coldly. Samuel lowered his eyes. "I owe you an explanation." Jacob stepped forward slightly, placing himself between them without making it obvious. The gesture was small, but Evelyn noticed. Samuel explained that another man had been using his name. Years earlier, while working on railroad crews, he had shared a bunkhouse with a dishonest drifter who frequently borrowed identities to avoid debts. Somehow that man had obtained several of Samuel's personal details and had used them in correspondence scams across different states. By the time Samuel learned what had happened, the imposter had vanished. Recently, he had discovered one of the old letters and spent months tracing the victims. Evelyn listened silently. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part no longer cared. The truth was simple. Whether through fraud or deception, the dream she had followed was never real. "Why come here now?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. "Because I wanted to apologize. Because someone destroyed your trust using my name." He reached into his coat and handed her a small bundle of letters. They were copies of complaints and reports from other women who had received similar correspondence. evidence supporting his story. Evelyn accepted them but felt no satisfaction. The anger she once carried had already burned itself away. What remained was clarity. Samuel represented a chapter of her life that no longer belonged to her. After a long silence, she spoke. "I crossed half the country because of those letters. I know. I cried for weeks because of them." Samuel nodded. "I know." Evelyn looked toward the snow-covered valley, then toward the ranch house standing strong against the winter wind. Finally, she met his eyes. "But if none of it had happened, I wouldn't be here." For the first time, Samuel seemed to understand. His gaze shifted briefly toward Jacob. A faint smile touched his lips. Then, perhaps some good came from it after all. He stayed only long enough to finish his apology. By sunset, he was gone, disappearing into the falling snow just as unexpectedly as he had arrived. That evening, the ranch felt unusually quiet. Evelyn sat beside the fireplace while flames danced across the logs. Jacob remained standing near the window, staring into the darkness outside. Finally, he spoke. "Do you believe him?" "Maybe." She folded her hands in her lap. "But it doesn't matter anymore." Jacob nodded slowly. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Silence settled between them. Not awkward silence. The kind that comes when two people are standing at the edge of something important. Evelyn looked around the room. Months earlier, this house had belonged only to Jacob. Now traces of her presence existed everywhere. The curtains she had chosen, the flowers she had planted before winter, the warmth that filled rooms, once left empty. "When I first came here," she said softly, "I thought my life was over." Jacob turned toward her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think it was just beginning." For a moment he said, "Nothing." Then he crossed the room and stopped beside her chair. His voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "This house has felt different since you arrived." Evelyn's heart raced. "Different how?" He took a breath, as though gathering courage. "Like a home." The words hung in the air. Honest. Simple. Real. Exactly like the man who spoke them. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. All her life she had searched for certainty and promises written on paper, yet the thing she truly needed had been standing beside her all along. Not grand speeches, not perfect letters, just a good man whose actions matched his heart. Jacob gently took her hand. "I don't have fancy words," he admitted. "Never have." Evelyn laughed softly through her tears. "Good. I think I've had enough letters for one lifetime." That made him smile. A real smile. Rare and wonderful. Outside, snow continued falling across the valley. Inside, two lonely hearts finally found what they had been searching for. And if you enjoyed this journey of hope, love, and second chances, make sure you subscribe to Legend of West right now, because the next story waiting for you may be even more unforgettable than this one.